How do you go about getting an exorcism?
A young girl is seriously ill and no one quite knows how to treat her. Do they operate? Do they sedate her? Or do they call a priest? A movie that calls the book 101 Uses for a Crucifix to be updated to 102 Uses for a Crucifix.
That the power of Christ compels you!
The Exorcist.
Jesus Christ, won't somebody
No, you
help
don't
me?
see, you don't understand. Your daughter.
God, can't you help her? Just help her!
The Exorcist is a 1973 horror film where unusual things start happening around a young girl, and then things escalate to the point where the only thing left to do is to hold an exorcism. It's not a gory film per se, and modern horror fans would probably consider it quite tame, but it is still quite unsettling for a mainstream studio film from the early 70s. If for no other reason, because it's about a child who's possessed by a demon, and it's a child with quite the potty mouth.
Fucking bastard!
The Exorcist starts off rather slowly, with a full half hour or so elapsing before the weird stuff really starts in earnest. Father Merrin is on an archaeological dig in Iraq where he finds a concerning artifact and has a troubling vision. Father Damien Karras is a psychiatrist for priests who's having doubts about his own faith and is dealing with his ailing mother in New York. Actress Chris McNeil is in Washington making a film while her 12-year-old daughter Regan seems to be a well-adjusted child despite her father not making the effort to call her on her birthday. The unusual starts off with noises coming from the attic, a Ouija board with a mind of its own, but then at a party hosted by Chris,
You're gonna die up there.
things take a turn. And that's the last time Lebowski lent anyone his rug. Regan's doctor thinks she might have a brain lesion, but after several excruciating scenes of medical tests, there's no apparent physical reason for her issues.
She's acting like she's fucking out of her mind, psychotic, like a split personality or...
The next step is having her evaluated by psychiatrists, but no head shrinker can explain a bed shaking, her voice, or her discovery of the 102nd thing to do with a crucifix. Her swearing may have shocked parents who somehow thought that their little angel doesn't know those words or what they meant. Once the really vile stuff starts happening, we will see very little of Regan's own persona and just the more demonic scenes. There's the unexplained death of director Burke Dennings, who's somehow fallen out of Regan's window and crashed down a very long flight of stairs. Police Lieutenant Kinderman has been investigating the link between a church desecration and the director's death. Kinderman suspects foul play, and we're not talking about chickens playing baseball. Father Karras arrives on scene, though it's as a psychiatrist rather than a priest.
She's already seen every fucking psychiatrist in the world and they sent me to you. Now you're gonna send me back to them?
He downplays Chris's idea about exorcism as a solution, saying it's rarely used anymore and involves so much red tape within the church that it's almost impossible to get it authorized.
Well, the first thing, I'd have to get him into a time machine and get him back to the 16th century.
However, this is a movie called The Exorcist, and so without too much friction, the ritual can go ahead. Father Merrin, from the start of the film, is called in to perform the ritual with Karras assisting. The exorcism itself sees the demon within Regan play some really dirty pool.
Why, Dimmy?
Appearing to Karras as his recently dead mother, which leads to Merrin going solo for a spell. His heart gives out, leaving Karras to continue, where he beats Regan to try and get the demon to leave her body and possess him. But now with his own demonic co-pilot, he jumps out the window, leaving Regan free from possession with no memory of her experience.
I cast you out! Unclean spirit!
Shove it up your ass!
The Exorcist is a film that had a lot of problems during its production, problems that were spun by some as the production being cursed due to the subject matter, but much of that seems to emanate not from demonic intervention, but from an auteur director for whom incredibly intense in their work is probably the nicest descriptor. William Peter Blatty was a comedy writer who'd written novels and screenplays in the 60s before finding himself out of work for a spell. He would turn to a more serious subject matter when he wrote the book that would become his most notable work, where it was based partly on a 1949 case of a supposed real-life demonic possession.
You probably know as much about possession as most priests.
Blatty liked the idea of something like Rosemary's Baby, but with a less goofy ending, and his novel, snappily titled The Exorcist, was first published in 1971. After a tentative launch, the book would eventually become a bestseller, and it wasn't long before the idea of a film version was talked about. There was just one little problem. William Peter Blatty insisted that he adapt his book and produce the film.
It's rare, but it does cause bizarre hallucinations.
Several directors were considered, but former documentary filmmaker William Friedkin was eventually hired, hot off the back of The French Connection, for which he would win an Academy Award for Best Director. In that movie, Friedkin's mantra was ultra-realism, which was something that he would carry over to The Exorcist. Of course, unless you're actually going to find a young girl demonically possessed, then you might just have to fudge things a bit. Let's not get too far into the weeds with this realism shit. It is a movie, and it's a movie about a girl being possessed by a demon. Casting for the movie would be tricky since, as we said earlier, finding somebody with the right combination of acting ability and demonic possession was easier said than done. In the end, they decided to just go with someone who could act and worry about the demonic possession later. Linda Blair had appeared in a few roles on television and movies and could bring the right mix of sweetness
Here, I'll show you.
and malice.
Your mother sucks cocks in hell, Paris.
Her performance as Regan was brave and uncompromising, though The Exorcist would remain her highest profile role over a very long career where there were some bumps along the way. The adult characters were mostly played by relative unknowns and character actors. Ellen Burstyn had been around a while in stage and television roles, but had only recently broken out into larger film roles.
How did they get an exorcism?
Chris MacNeil is a character who loves her daughter, but takes out her frustrations on the army of doctors, psychiatrists, and priests who are all very loath to give her any solid answers. Playwright Jason Miller was another virtual unknown as Father Karras, a guy who realised that the priest thing has more downsides than upsides. Veteran character actor Lee J. Cobb was the police Lieutenant Kinderman, who seemed more interested in making friends than tracking down a killer. Max von Sydow as the aged priest Merrin appears at the start and end of the film. As Merrin was a much older character than Max von Sydow at the time, he's slathered in makeup. Merrin's been through exorcisms before, but he has a heart condition and it's very touch and go as to whether he'll survive this exorcism. Spoilers, of course, he doesn't. His death sends Karras into a rage where he beats the possessed Regan as if he was having a bad day and taking it out by working a sourdough mix. Actual priests were cast to play priest roles in the movie. So if any filmmaker wants absolute realism in their films and is making a film about a haunted patisserie, give me a call. The story is mainly set in Washington, D.C., where much of the location shooting took place. The stairs where Karras tumbles down have become a tourist attraction for fans of the movie, while the house representing the home of Chris and Regan had a facade added to it by the production. That house became a major part of the film's marketing thanks to the now famous shot of Father Merrin arriving.
Oh, I command you!
Interiors were mainly shot on the soundstage in New York. This is a film with mainly physical effects, with lots of trick props, mechanical gags, and breakaway sets. Extensive makeup effects were used for Regan in her possessed state, and Linda Blair was often doubled by an older actress in some scenes.
Fuck me!
A lifelike dummy was produced for some effects, such as Regan's rotating head. Lifelike dummies aren't that uncommon. I did once have one so that I could use the commuter lane to drive to work, but it wasn't until after I woke up in the hospital that I realised my mistake. I really shouldn't have put the dummy in the driver's seat. One scene not used in the original cut but reinstated years later saw Regan walking like a spider. Now, spiders scare the hell out of some people, so obviously a demonically possessed child walking like a spider was just a bridge too far for 1970s audiences.
Where's Regan?
In here with us.
For that extra touch of realism, Regan's room was built with refrigeration to help sell the extreme cold caused by her possession. Possession sounds like it's all swings and roundabouts. I mean, there's all the vomit, the broken furniture, and bloodied crucifixes. I mean, that's the downside. But just think of all the energy savings when you don't need to run your air conditioning all summer. I guess timing is everything, because trying to time your child's demonic possession to coincide with a heat wave and then somehow free them again before winter could just be a little bit tricky.
Belief in the power of exorcism can make it disappear.
Then there were all the various production problems. There was an unexplained fire which burnt down a set which caused the production to shut down. Several injuries among the cast and crew, and deaths both tangential to the movie and of people actually involved with the movie. Ooh, a movie about demonic possession is cursed, but at least some of the problems were exaggerated for dramatic effect when publicising the film. The movie would of course go wildly over budget. The initial budget of around $4 million did not account for all of the fake vomit and props, nor did it account for Friedkin's working methods.
Well, you know this director was doing the film here.
He would go for take after take. He would harass actors and crew. Friedkin would fire guns to get a shocked expression from the cast members. He would slap one actor to get the right reaction. Sorry, correction. He slapped a priest to get the right reaction. And of course, he would just reshoot scenes again and again. The crew would end up fearful of Friedkin's, how do we say this nicely? Intensity. In some ways, he was treating his cast as if they were method actors, where, in the acting method, actors will go to extreme lengths to get into a character, to inhabit a character. Of course, most actors weren't method actors, so to have that forced on you by a director wasn't always appreciated. I do actually appreciate that, as I once had my tax done by a method accountant, where to work out my deductions, they hung out with me for a few weeks and we watched old movies together. That's how they got a feel for how I worked, what I did, and of course, what they could claim for provided I had the receipts. William Peter Blatty and Friedkin clashed frequently during the making of the film. While wearing his writer's hat, Blatty would be offended at Friedkin's changes or cuts, and then he'd switch over to his producer's hat and be frustrated by Friedkin's indulgent way of working. The two would patch things up, though neither would quite be able to match the success of the first Exorcist movie in any of their individual projects. Friedkin liked the fact that audiences could have different interpretations of what happened, while Blatty took issue with the idea that people could watch the film and think that the devil had won. Meanwhile, my sicko auntie Beryl was way more concerned about where she could get a crucifix like the one used in the movie. The final budget would be around 3 times that of the original estimate, meaning there was a concern at Warner Brothers that the R-rated horror film with some quite shocking aspects and some very difficult scenes might struggle at the box office. Nah. People lined up around the block to get in to see The Exorcist, and in screenings there were reports of people running from their seats either to be ill or possibly to take the opportunity to pop out and sneakily buy a crucifix. People lined up to see The Exorcist. People were sickened by The Exorcist, but people loved The Exorcist. The film was released very late in December 1973 and would become the year's most successful release. It was also a critical favourite, becoming the first horror film to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. It also garnered acting nominations for Blair, Burstyn and Jason Miller. It would win Oscars for Best Sound and for William Peter Blatty's adapted screenplay. There would be various re-releases and extended cuts which increased the film's box office take. Friedkin had always maintained that the theatrical cut was his ideal cut of the movie, but later worked on an extended cut which would restore some of the excised materials that Blatty had thought essential. These extended cuts are a little disjointed, with scenes of Regan having tests for hyperactivity long before she exhibits signs of possession. Either cut is good, but the original is much tighter. Sequels would show up. Blair starred in a 1977 follow-up directed by John Boorman, while Blatty directed the third Exorcist film in 1990. There were also prequels and remakes.
Have you ever heard of Exorcism?
There would also be many similar types of films involving hauntings, possessions, and the like. Catholic priests may have seen an upswing in requests for exorcism services. It's a little known fact, but a few years ago I got into exorcism myself. Yeah, it just starts off as a hobby, you know, just exorcising little things like hamsters and gerbils. You would be surprised at how many small rodents are actually demonically possessed. Later, that hobby became a side hustle. I do them over Zoom, which has its pros and cons. You have to send the victims the holy water and the post ahead of time and tell them to douse themselves. But on the plus side, you also avoid getting projectile vomit all over your clothes. I used to do tele-exorcisms over Skype, but then they tried to move everybody over to MS Teams. But that wouldn't work for me, since Teams is already demonically possessed enough as it is.
God damn you! Take me!
Composer Lalo Schifrin was originally hired to record a score for the movie, which of course Friedkin hated. The final film version of The Exorcist did not have a traditional score, and there are large sections of the film with no music, apart from one piece of music that was not written for a horror movie. British multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield had crafted a concept album called Tubular Bells. It was a long instrumental split into 2 parts that filled an entire album. Friedkin heard the music and insisted that Warner Brothers license it for use in The Exorcist. When the album was first released in mid-1973, it sold slowly, but sales rocketed after its use in the film. Tubular Bells would become a massive success in its own right, but there are still many who will immediately associate that album's intro with The Exorcist. If you're a fan of psychological horror, The Exorcist is still shocking in its own way. More so if, like me, You're not a huge fan of horror movies?
The power of Christ compels you!
I'd known of the film for decades, but I've never actually sat down to watch it before today, despite back in the day being dragged to see films like Amityville Horror and Poltergeist in a theatre at a ridiculously young age, of course. Like many people, the most uncomfortable scenes are not necessarily of the preteen girl treating a crucifix as a marital aid or her screaming obscenities, but the chilling scenes of her undergoing actual medical tests. After a slow start, I think I really did like the film, though I can't say I have any inclination to continue with the litany of follow-ups. The Exorcist is one of those seminal horror films that's very hard to spell, but it can be enjoyed by the non-horror fan, provided, of course, that they're not repulsed completely by the subject matter. Of course, that is kind of the point. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.